firstly say hello and thank you so much for joining us for our panel event today, our second in the series for housing associations that we're running here at NewRoll. And this one is entitled Increasing Pressure, Complexity and Regulation, How Are Housing Association Boards Responding? To quickly introduce myself, I'm Edward Elliott. I'm head of our public sector team here at NewRoll, and I co-lead our work in the housing association sector. And today I will be your host alongside my colleague Samuel Ellis. And we're both incredibly thankful and excited to be joined by Delroy, Jane and Parveen for the discussion today. Some quick housekeeping before we jump into the meat of the session. This session is being recorded, and you will have the opportunity to watch back later if there's anything you'd like to recap on. It will last around 50 minutes, so we're hoping to sort of let you go just before 6 p.m. I'd also like just to recommend and acknowledge that we've got lots of individuals who are listening in who do sit on housing association boards, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for the panel, as well as your opinions in terms of the questions that are asked. We really do encourage you to submit those questions and comments as much as you would like. Really, this session is here to try and answer any sort of burning questions or queries you might have. So please do use the chat function in Zoom to post your queries, and Sam and myself will be jumping in and asking those of the panel. Before we quickly jump in, we're just quite aware that for some individuals, NewRoll might be new, or you might not know a huge amount about us. So before we jump into the session, I'm just going to quickly hand over to my colleague Sam, just to give a quick overview of who we are at NewRoll and what we're all about, really. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Ed. So I'm Sam. I lead the real estate practice here, and as Ed said, we co-lead the housing association practice together. As you said, 90% of you, I'm sure, know exactly who we are, but for those few who don't, we are a search firm changing and democratizing the way boards hire by combining technology and human skill. And we're unique in that we only do non-execs, chairs and trustees. We match members based on relevant roles, based on their experience and interests. They can then self-select, apply in their own words, or recommend friends and colleagues. We also do the headhunting piece as well. We now have 65,000 members, all of whom are either on board or board ready. And as of this week, we've just done our 3,000th placement, and that's across all industries and sectors, from FTSE 100s to universities. We've done just shy of 60 housing association placements over the past couple of years, many of whom I can see are on this call today. And with that, I'll hand back to Ed.
Amazing. Sam, thank you very much. So as I say, we'll jump into the questions, but please do put your questions in the chat as well. Just to start off and go around each of yourselves on the panel. As we all know, housing associations come in all shapes and sizes, and the roles that boards can play can differ quite a lot depending on size, but also the types of residents you're supporting, the relationship with local areas or local authorities. Maybe just to give the panel a little bit of a sense of the perspectives you might be coming with, it'd be great to just go around each of you, maybe starting with yourself, Jane, in terms of either a board you're currently sitting on or boards you previously sat on. What is the role of the board and yourself within that board, and how might it differ from others, and what's particularly unique?
Thanks, Ed. So I'm Jane Earle, and I currently have the privilege of chairing two housing associations, one which I'll probably talk about most today, which is 13 up in the northeast of England, based around the Thames Valley. We have stock in Stockton-on-Tees, which is now much more famous following the Home Secretary's unfortunate comments in the House of Commons. And we are a general needs housing association. The other one, which is relevant, but I'll talk about less, is I chair the M&G Shared Ownership Housing Association, which is a for-profit. And I think that both of those actually provide a really good microcosm of how boards differ, because I think the big thing for us in 13 is very much about how do we make sure that everything we do is focused on the long term and the stewardship responsibilities that we all have as board members and trustees. This is not a business that you come into and think that you'll have sold on in the next 3 years or anything of that sort. This is one where we have to have our eyes on the long term, because for the 70,000 people who live in our homes with 13, it is their homes and they want them to be their homes for the very long term. So our board focus is absolutely on good stewardship and looking to the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jane. And Delroy, maybe to come over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So similar sort of context and background. So I've served on the board of housing associations, ALMOs, charitable housing associations, and each has a slightly different purview, not dissimilar to Jane's comments. Ultimately, where those boards are there to oversee, steer and influence the organisation to ensure that it's meeting its obligations in relations to providing homes and where people generally live and those communities. I think the one thing that I would say, having had some private sector board experience, the outlook is completely different. So if you serve on the board of an ALMO, which is an arm's length management organisation, the purview in that regard is very different from maybe a private sector organisation or an housing association board. That's just my experience. One of the things that I think has been, and I mentioned it earlier, one of the things that I think has been a game changer and has put a greater amount of responsibility on board members is what happened across in Rochdale, where a young boy lost his life. So the regulator stepped in there. There was still investigations going on. The executive left, etc., etc. So boards play different roles depending on what part of the country you're in and how attuned they are with their customer base.
I think that's such a good point, and I think probably one we'll come back round to throughout the discussion later today. Parveen, maybe over to yourself to introduce.
Yeah, so I'm Parveen Ray. I sit currently on 2 boards. They're very different in size. One has 4,000 homes. It's called Inclusion Housing Up North. It's a lease-based model, very agile, very entrepreneurial, very forward-thinking in many ways. So it doesn't really kind of sit into a standard, very slow type of, moving organisation. There's a lot of complexity going on around that currently, but it's a sort of organisation that is optimum in the way it sort of deals with challenges. The other organisation that I sit on is very different. It's called Live West. It's the second largest social housing organisation, Southwest of the country. They've got 40,000 homes. They've grown through kind of, joining with other organisations, and here we are today with 40,000 homes. I sit on their customer service committee, whereas with Live West, I'm on the audit and risk as well as the main board. So 2 very different organisations with very different sort of lenses that I go into each one. And you have to wear a different hat for each role that you're doing when you're in audit and risk. It's very different from when you're on the general board. Conversations are very different. So you kind of, have to kind of adapt and adjust to which table you're sitting at. And really, a lot of the things are very similar in many ways. The external environment impacts both organisations, very similar: interest rates, economic situation, COVID, So whilst the organisations are very different and their internal, at least 50% of their internal kind of stuff will be quite different, there will also be a significant part that's very similar, and it's just recognising and being relevant when you're sat at those board meetings and making sure that you're adding, value that's relevant to that particular organisation and where they are at that time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there, Parveen, I guess the external factors, which are similar across different housing associations of different sizes, but are actually in some cases changing quite rapidly, whether it be cost of living, whether it be this sort of increase in regulation or changes in regulation. Delroy, maybe to come to you first in that first topic that we had earmarked around regulation. We are going through a period of increased regulation that is affecting boards and housing boards in different ways, depending on the type of organisation they are. how have you seen that increase in regulation impact in terms of the conversations you've had around boards in the housing space, and how have you seen boards react?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when I look back at the last couple of years, the whole thing around safety and safe homes, quality of service from the landlord, respect for tenants and residents, tenancy involved in and influence decisions that affect them. All of those things now are bringing an additional responsibility to boards. And I think, certainly from my perspective, the days when the resident didn't have a voice at a board level are long gone. And I think the fact that the regulator is putting more of a focus on that now is influencing the sort of compositions that in terms of what makes up a board. I think diversity, both in terms of skills and perspective, and becomes a strategic asset in navigating the intricacies of those new regulations. But I think the aim is to assemble a board that has a multifaceted skill set and a range of perspectives that can adaptly address the nuanced challenges posed by the regulatory changes. This short-term recalibration is crucial in my mind for ensuring that the board is equipped to meet the immediate compliance requirements and manage the emerging risks effectively, because there are risks. And, if you speak to some of the former board members I mentioned as an organisation earlier, where the regulator stepped in and the board stood down, those risks are massive, not just in reputational terms, but actually from a customer perspective, that if it can happen to someone else, it can happen to me, sort of thing. So I think in that regard, regulation and how the board is composed has become a different set of skill sets than maybe it was 10, 15 years ago.
I think that's a really good example. And Jane, maybe to come to you, both in terms of the board composition, but as Doris says, some of this is having to change very quickly, and boards are having to adapt quite quickly if they haven't already had some of these individuals representing residents in place. How have you, from the boards that you've sat on or spoken with, tried to make that adaptation at pace in a way, or where have you seen the most effective changes being made?
So I think there are two things I'd say about that. The first thing, the focus in regulation and the more overt bits of regulation that are coming on, there is a real risk for boards that what you do is you try and act in a way that you think will make you safe from the regulator. And of course, as we know, the thing that makes you most safe from the regulator is by doing a jolly good job to start with. There is no board, however good a board is, will get away from the fact if there isn't a good service level going on within the organisation to start with. So it's the lesson we've all learned from in the education sector from Ofsted inspections. There's no point in just having a really good set of policies for when the inspector calls if you don't put them into practice with the children in the schools on the way. So that's my mantra at all times. We mustn't get overwhelmed by what the regulator is telling us, because most of it is actually what we ought to be doing anyway. I think the point about how we involve tenants and residents is a really interesting one. And actually, it's been a joy to go to 13, because there's been a strong history of resident involvement for a long time. And we have a board, the chair of our Involved Customers Group actually is a board attendee. She's not a board director, but she attends all of the boards. We involve them in recruitment, we involve them in policy review, all of those sorts of things. But the way that the board get to hear about all of that is, it's a blindingly simple idea. We get about a 10-minute YouTube video, which is always part of the pack for the board meeting. And one of my jobs as chair is just to look at people and ask them a question about what they thought about what colleague X said in that. And then it's very clear whether they've watched it or not. And so now they've learned that watching it is really quite a good idea. And that's not about trying to catch people out, but it is because it's genuinely important that we hear that. And of course, it means that because we've produced that piece of material for the board, it's then a tool to be able to share within the business more widely. It's a tool we can put onto our website. It's a really good way of encouraging other involved customers in. so that has been, that was in place for some time. We've only just set up a customer service committee. As to what Parveen said, we've now had just coming up to a year of that, which is built on our involved customer networks. And I suppose that the question for me is, at what point will we start to say, not we're going to put a special place on the board for a customer, but who are the people who are coming through that involved customer network who want to come and become part of the board and come through it because they have the right skill mix. The only other thing I was just going to say quickly is that we've also been part with a number of other associations in the Northeast of a board apprentice programme, where again, we've had some really interesting young people, because if our diversity is bad in terms of ethnicity, and sometimes in terms of gender, and often in terms of disability, it's even more so in terms of age and background. So that board apprentice programme, I think, is definitely worth us keeping a close eye on. Sorry, that was slightly more than you asked me, Ed. Sorry.
Not at all. That was fantastic. Actually, it teed up in some ways the question, Parveen, I was going to pass on to you a little bit, which was, I was going to make a sort of fairly trite comparison sometimes in terms of, you mentioned inclusion being quite an innovative housing association, and sometimes innovation and regulation don't always sit side by side. But I think actually, Jane, you pointed out two good examples with the YouTube video and board apprenticeships where new approaches actually can be really effective in terms of enabling innovation. But I'd just be really interested in your reflections, Parveen, on what Delroy and Jane have mentioned, particularly given those two different sizes of organizations and how you've adapted to regulation.
Yeah, I think the increasing regulation is a good thing. All it actually does ultimately, as Jane says, it sets the bar higher for the organisations to work at a higher level, which ultimately is going to serve our customers better. So it's all it does. It just really encourages, or puts more pressure on for the organisations to be providing a better service, and that's what we're here to do. Regulation isn't just kind of special for the social housing sector. Regulation is in any sector or industry you go to, whether you're in the private sector, public sector, housing, non-housing. So regulation is there for a purpose. It's to make sure that the right thing is done, and that there's no shortcuts taken, and that there's no kind of adverse results, bad situations that happen, such as the one that Delroy mentioned earlier. I totally agree with Jane's viewpoint on, and I'm a big advocate myself about bringing younger people onto boards. I do believe actually most boards should have somebody under the age of 30, but with the relevant skill set. And there are many good candidates out there. I've sat on a board in Aston University, where they had an amazing young man who was under the age, one of these 30 under 30, brought so much to the board. Most boards the remit I give is, who is on your board that is under the age of 30, and if not, why not? They live in a different mindset, a different era with technological advances to what somebody would, 40 plus. And I think it's just something that does get missed on many boards, and it's almost, a blind eye is turned to that. And I think we miss a trick there for sure. With regards to diversity isn't just females or ethnicity, or it's the background as well. How diverse is the background? I'm not your typical non-executive. I haven't sat at the top of an organisation with 50,000 people under me, but what I have done is set up good sized businesses within the property sector without any support or help, and I've managed to sort of gain and hone skills which are valuable. I don't bring the same thinking to boards, but that's what's appreciated.
Absolutely. And I think if everyone hasn't seen in the chat, I think very helpfully, Mushtaq, thank you so much for putting the link to the board trainee program in there, which I'm sure is a great resource. And I was going to ask Parveen and Jane, you sort of both mentioned sort of bringing kind of residents through to hopefully enter in as sort of full board members. I'd wonder if there were individuals who are maybe part of a housing association who had aspirations of developing the same. Are there any sort of learnings or steps you've taken, Jane, maybe to come to you, that you found particularly effective in sort of fostering residents to come through onto boards?
So interestingly, I before I went to 13, I was a board member of Vivid in Hampshire, and we set up a variety of ways of developing our customer involvement. And of course, one of the things we were really surprised about is that we found all sorts of skills in residents that we might not have thought were there in our residents, because there is a danger that we do this. We stereotype people who live in our homes are probably in a deficit model. And in fact, actually, that's not true. Lots of people who live in our homes are living there because it suits their circumstances. So we found the most amazing man, and Jane Tabor's in the call. She might even remember this, but a man who turned out to be the head of internal audit for a quite significant sized company, who was just brilliant at looking at our data and about our performance figures, asking the sort of questions which, frankly, we on the board hadn't necessarily done in quite the same degree of thoughtful, well, not thoughtfulness, but skill and ability. And it was interesting seeing, him come forward. We also set up a charitable foundation and discovered that one of our shared owners in Vivid was he was so young. I can barely say, he was younger than my youngest child, but he was a fast streamer in civil service. And again, he just brought a really interesting set of perspectives, and it made me think that although we think properly we should go out and look for people from the very widest ranges of backgrounds, there are people close to home. And if we find a way of feeling welcoming enough to say, we would value your skills, then folks will, in these cases, literally volunteer to help us. So I think the Vivid example is probably as good as any in finding those hidden gems.
Edward, can I just build on
Please, yeah.
Jane's comments? I mean, I've seen some of the most exemplar organizations really work this to good effect. So quite often, from a resident's perspective, what people perceive is what they believe. So if they look at your board and they can't see a reflection of themselves, they won't come forward. So I know an organization in the Midlands where I was an executive, where they actively went into those communities and attracted some quite, I would say now when I look back, some quite controversial residents to join the board. But what they did, they put a framework in place, Edward, that provided development and support and training for that individual. But that didn't mean that they wanted to suffocate the contribution that those individuals made. They just made that contribution in a more professional way. And it really, really worked incredibly well. And I think the days of housing associations just sitting back and expecting people to come, those days are long gone. You've got a generation now that, in my mind, is very disconnected from the mainstream, and they think and act in a completely different way. I was talking to an housing association only 3 weeks ago who were advertising for board members on TikTok. Just imagine it, Edward. TikTok. I don't even know how to register for TikTok. But what they were saying to me was the reason why they're advertising on TikTok is because there is a generation of people that live within that space that they want to attract onto their board, and they're very successful at doing that.
Delroy, music to my ears. I've been pushing for Neural to set up a TikTok account for years, so finally some evidence. But no, really great points, and I think it's definitely something. I think to your point, Delroy, in terms of the days of sitting back and waiting for people to apply, something I think, Sam, I'm sure you would agree, we see a lot in terms of Neural, in terms of it doesn't matter a lot in terms of even the things in terms of how you write your spec and how you're referring to yourself and showcasing yourself. Does make a big difference in terms of how individuals perceive your organization, whether they be residents or they be from other housing associations looking to apply. And something I think we see the results at the end in terms of the candidates that come through. So I couldn't agree more. The second topic we were going to jump into, and to say again, if anyone does have any questions or would like to jump in on the chat, we will take questions at the end as well. So do feel free to add questions if you'd like to. Obviously, we're going through a moment of quite extreme economic pressure, and it's been building for a period of time on housing. On often we talk about, as we mentioned already, the balance between sort of long-term and short-term decision making, and how that balance is different from the private to the public sector, but always there is some balance that needs to be struck. And I'd be really keen, Parveen, maybe to come to you first, just to ask in terms of how has the current economic climate affected how boards you've sat on are thinking about the balance between the long term and the short term when it comes to strategic decision making? Or has it changed at all? Is actually the processes you're going through at the board the same, but maybe just the outcomes are different?
No, the viewpoints on both boards are very different, and it's quite interesting. And I think some of it is to do with the fact the size they are and where they are in their journey of growth. So the smaller organisation, they, that they feel, when it comes to things like interest rate, because they're a lease-based model, they haven't got this issue around construction stopped, but it's affecting them in a different way because the people that are building the properties, a lot of them are exiting, and they're not, these opportunities aren't coming to their door as easily as they were, when the interest rates were 2%. However, the larger organisations where they're building their own properties and they're doing their own, construction, they are affected by the interest rates, but I guess more directly rather than externally. So they do have the same set of challenges, but just in a very different way. It affects their growth, but the facets that they're dealing with are different. One is dealing with external people coming in and doing the work externally, and then that they get their growth that way. Whereas the large organisation, it's all in-house. So, the way they look and plan for the future is also very different, navigating, how they're going to sort of continue to operate as the interest rates are where they are now, and on some level trying to forecast what the future brings, and interestingly, one organisation seems to think they'll wait for interest rates not to be so high, which, somebody like myself will come in and say, well, I think you need to remember that this is the norm when it comes to interest rates. This is a normal level of interest rates. If you look at the economic sort of, journey of interest rates, 4 or 5% is considered average. So you're waiting for something that might never happen, and how are you going to, be okay and build on that? So, learning to sort of really kind of manage the expectations of that organisation and make sure that they are actually, the conversations are actually have some substance behind them, regardless of their size.
I think that's a really great point. And actually, Jane, to pass on to you, I think what Parveen has really neatly laid out is these topics can be incredibly complex, and it's very natural for board members to come with different perspectives on these big strategic topics. I just wonder from your perspective as a chair in terms of, what structures can boards put in place to really effectively make sure that all the stones are being turned over in terms of different options and different points of view to make sure you're approaching these complex topics from every angle.
I think it's a real challenge, and I think that there are sort of two principles that I use to inform my thinking about how we're going to hold those conversations. The first one is that we all have to be able to handle ambiguity. There is very little which is certain and straightforward and easy. And if it was, we probably wouldn't be doing the jobs we are. And the second principle is that we shouldn't allow ourselves to be paralysed by always wanting just one more bit of information, because, we've all seen opportunities pass us by because we thought, well, let's just, as Parveen says, let's just hope the interest rates are going back down again, or let's just hope something different happens. I think it's particularly interesting for me in the Northeast because lots of things that housing associations would do would be to say, let's have a development programme, let's build new houses, and then let's take the profits from those in order to put back into our social rented stock. And that's a really great idea, except that if you're trying to do that at a time with increased building costs and flatlining house prices, which are, a fraction of what they might be in more affluent parts of the country, you simply can't make that happen. And I think we can all spend a lot of time trying to persuade funders or Homes England or anybody else that, you know, if we just wait another 3 months, the market will have picked up and then we can go ahead and do that. So I think the job of the chair is to allow people to feel uncomfortable, and to say that it's not straightforward. It's also to allow people to think about what's the least worst outcome rather than necessarily the best outcome. One of the things we did at 13 last year, the executive team did it. I mean, I take no credit from the board. When we were thinking about the impact of the rent cap, they produced the hierarchy of trade-offs, which is, what would this mean for us if with a capped rent? What would we stop doing? How would we stop doing things? Where would we place our funding and attention? And that was quite an uncomfortable conversation for lots of people, both in the business and in the board. But actually, it was a really helpful way of framing that conversation, which was an acceptance we can't do everything. So how do we make the best possible choices for our residents now and in the long term for our residents for the future?
Edward, just building on Jane's and Parveen's commentary there, an organisation where I used to be the deputy chair of the board was at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And one of the things that we used to do there, we would do deep dives into topic areas. So we'd have a board meeting where we specifically focused on a particular topic and worked right through it with the board and the executive. We took that a stage further then by away days, activity focused, and we brought specialists in to sort of facilitate and support around the discussions. And then there's this thing about when you bring internal and external experts together to lead those discussions, those are the sort of things that, particularly when you're looking over a short to medium to longer term, as Jane said, you're not going to have all of the information all of the time. And I've seen those naive organizations that sit and wait, but actually the proactive ones make use of the information that they've got and the work with external experts to be able to facilitate around those discussions, and they're usually ahead of the game when it comes to sort of thinking about the short, medium and long term.
Fantastic.
On that, sorry, Edward, but just to come back in on that and answering your question a bit about regulation, Edward's earlier on. You know, there is a risk that boards will spend a lot of their time, which is limited by its nature, in checking that things have happened, and we stop looking at things that ought to be happening for the future. And again, I think that's a real challenge for all of us. And I certainly don't get it right all the time, but it feels to me that is a danger of the response to regulation.
Absolutely. In some ways, Delroy, you mentioned your time as a sort of deputy chair, but I know you've also been a CEO of housing associations. And I kind of almost wanted to ask you, from the perspective of a CEO, you know, I hope this isn't the case ever been the case for yourself, Delroy, or for others who've sat on the call, but if maybe you're trying to sort of nudge your board to help you think about some of these larger challenges when you're an executive, and there might be some on the call. You found there are any tactics that have sometimes helped sort of get the board to a place where they're giving you the advice that might really help you get somewhere?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, I think it's important from a governance point of view how you structure your agenda. You know, and I'm sure Jane will attest to this. I've been in organisations where the board allows the executives to shape the agenda and the chair and the board go along with it. I like to work with the chair to develop the agenda and make sure that we're capturing the right topics. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think what gets discussed gets done. So I always think it's important to have an agenda item on a particular area as an executive that you're trying to focus on and get the board's input on. So one of the things that I used to regularly do was a monthly newsletter to the board. And I would always drip feed through that monthly newsletter things from an horizon scanning point of view, Edward, that I knew was coming up and things that I felt that the board needed to have an awareness of. Usually 2 or 3 board members would respond to that newsletter, then I'd facilitate a topic around it. So I use a lot of nudge techniques. So rather than saying, we must do this X, Y, Z, use subtle little nudge techniques, articles, research briefings, and just keep subtly dropping that, and then it becomes a discussion point. But I also think it's important that you've got the relationship. If you've got the relationship with the board, particularly the chair and the other, whether it's chair of audit, etc., those relationships, Ed, would mean you can bring those conversations forward, and then there's not a problem about doing that. That's my experience, and that's the approach that I would regularly take to doing that. Because I think what we have to remember, even if you take the regulatory perspective, regulation is about making sure people are safe, but regulation also has a symbiotic connection with influencing, steering, nudging, making sure you're using your position and your regulation to influence people around good practice. So those are the sort of things I did as a CEO and a managing director, actually.
Fantastic. I can see we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A chat. Sam, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on these.
Yes, well, I was going to wait because some of them are slightly different. I was going to wait until the end, but we can ask a couple of them now. One of them relates to one of the earlier conversations about the resident board members. So what framework do you provide for your resident board members to access the corporate business information, and how are they influencing the culture of your associations?
Parveen, maybe to come to you first.
Yeah. So specifically with the larger organisation, LiveWest, they take quite a structured approach. They have a InFocus residents group where they have a couple people on there that manage the whole group, and there's members that attend that represent each sort of area of sort of where they operate. So it's almost like a web where all the information that needs to get up to board level ultimately can be brought to board level. So an organization where there's 40,000 homes, how do you capture in one resident group everybody's information and feelings on whatever's going on, but most importantly the relevant stuff and the important stuff that's useful. So this is where the InFocus group acts like a filter and brings to the board the really important topics so that we stay connected to our customer base, because ultimately the customer is always heart and center of your business. And this is one of the things I on their customer service committee constantly sort of try and make sure they keep that at the forefront, and they're in touch with their customer of today, which many of them, as mentioned before, are young people that don't operate and live in the world that maybe I grew up in, and we need to always make sure that we're speaking to them in the world they exist, rather than expecting them to meet us on our level. And this group works really well. It's a really good practice. It's probably one of the best that I've seen across all sectors. The other place where I've seen it work really well was in the education sector on a university board, where they would have the two from the student union, they would have the two vice sort of chairs off the union that would attend every meeting. And it was, the way it operated was absolutely amazing, because where you'd have the board there and you'd have the exec saying, oh no, we did this, we've done it all right, all the students are happy. At the end, when the execs would be removed from the meeting, you'd have your two members from the representing students us sat there, and we would actually then say, well, is that the case? And often it was like, no, it's not the case. So it was a real good way of staying in touch with reality, what's actually going on the ground level, rather than what's being discussed at board level.
Samuel, could I just sort of add to that? You heard me mention TikTok earlier. I know an organisation where they routinely and regularly interact with their residents through Facebook and Instagram. Those are what I call the more subtle sides of that engagement. But in terms of a framework, I've seen it in organisations, certainly and boards where I've been a part of, where the resident's voice is genuinely taken seriously. And in fact, more seriously than it coming from another experienced executive or board member, because they realized that it's crucially important from a business perspective that they were engaging with the next generation of tenant activists, if I use that word. I was at the housing conference this year in Manchester, and when I go back 15 years ago, when I used to go, when it was in Harrogate, you look at the residents that are at them now compared to what they were, and it's a completely different thing. So that framework needs to ensure that it is structured, that the resident feels that it's accessible. That's really important, that you're giving them meaningful information to review and make decisions around, and actually not confusing them, or anybody else for that matter, with so much information that they think, what am I supposed to do with this? Because an organization does have a role to play in facilitating information in a way that is understandable, and that the resident can make decisions around that. And I think the regulator is looking for that now, more of the customer voice within organizations. So I think the whole structure around that has to continue to be done in a way that it's truly engaging and listening to the residents.
If I can just jump in on the back of that, Sam, I think what we've done at 13 is to say that we have a group of involved customers, and the principle is that all information that is accessible to the board is accessible to that group of involved customers. So there isn't a two-tier. You only get to see the things we think you ought to see, which is pretty important, and that's up to and including discussions about what the pay rises for staff are going to be, what the rent rises are going to be. There shouldn't be any no-go areas. We expect our residents to deal with the same confidentiality as anybody else around the table. Within our group of involved customers, we have what we've called stream leads. So there's one very able woman who leads the complaints review process. There's another one who leads the reviews of different policies and practices and mystery shopping. And that means that what we're trying to do is to say to people, you can have access to all the stuff we're talking about, but actually we're not expecting you to know everything about every aspect of the business, because we don't, that's not a reasonable thing to expect. We're not stopping you, but we really value the fact that you bring expertise and specialism. Clearly, the thing you've then got to do is you've got to rotate those people around, so you don't end up with only one person, Jim Scholar, knowing everything about policy review and nobody else ever getting a look in. So that's part of our succession planning within our involved customers networks, just in the same way as we have a succession plan for our board members.
Great. Thanks very much for that. And I think, turning our hands to cost, there are two questions which are linked slightly, albeit that they're not exactly the same. One is saying, with ever increasing regulation, external pressure, do small housing associations face a bigger challenge than the big ones? I'm thinking about the fixed compliance costs and how easy they can find skilled nurses to demonstrate oversight. And I think linked with that, I'll ask both together if I may. Always a slightly contentious topic, but someone else then talked about the cost of NEDs and saying housing associations do not pay NEDs enough to get the diversity and the technical skills they need at board level. Boards end up being populated by people who can afford it financially and often retired. It goes against diversity and social mobility and makes it harder to find skilled NEDs. Discuss. I'm not sure who would like to jump on that, but Parveen, perhaps if you'd like to.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, for sure. There is a lot of work, for a NED, reading, packs, and not only just reading. It's more about a good NED will actually get into the organisation, will actually go out and look at some of the properties, meet with, the people that work in the organisation, try and get an understanding of the challenges. So, if you're retired, that's easily done. But if you're wanting somebody who is quite relevant, who's working in, in the property sector, somebody like myself who works in the property sector, who understands the challenges. Currently, I'm dealing in my own organisation, as would the housing associations, because it's all to do with costs, it's all to do with interest rates, it's all to do with regulation, it's all to do with, being fit for purpose in 5 years' time rather than now, forward looking, all of the stuff that the organisation would need to continue to grow and do a better job. So I do agree that, that there is, that there is definitely a point there that's been made where they're not really paid always, accordingly. Somebody like myself, I do the work I do is definitely not for the remuneration. It's more to do with, do my sort of part, taking my skill set and making a difference in areas which I couldn't impact in my own business. So my reasons are not your typical reasons for being on a board. And you do run the risk of not being able to get people into, at that board level that will understand the sector, and the current, how to navigate the current climate, how to deal with the issues that are, really kind of the organisation's really struggling with, because they're not working potentially in that area on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's a lot of truth in that, and organisations do have to make a decision. Are they prepared to pay that little bit more, to get the right people in? And I personally think it's always a good investment to do that.
I've got a slightly different take on that, because I think Parveen's absolutely right that, a lot of people join housing association boards because they see it as a bit of public service. It's a giving back. And I am always, personally, when I'm interviewing for non-executive directors, people who tell me they're trying to build a portfolio to replace their executive salary, I'm always slightly worried about what that motivation really is. And I think there is a question. I think the question about smaller organisations, there is genuinely a question which residents might ask, which is, if you're already paying a team of expensive executives, why on earth do you need to pay an expensive team of non-executives? So I think there needs to be a balance, and there needs to be a coherent explanation from the organisation about why they've chosen to do what they do. I don't think there is a right answer to all of this. And I think the question about, is there a bigger burden on smaller organisations? I'm not sure it's necessarily harder to appoint or to recruit good non-executives, because potentially you've got more chance of getting your hands around the organisation and seeing what difference you make. And I think that's quite a big selling point for smaller organisations. I think once you get into the really, really big ones, much bigger than I'm involved with, it must feel quite hard. It must feel more like being on I suspect, a corporate board rather than one where you are genuinely saying, what difference will this make to the people who live in the block of flats in Middlesbrough, where we know that we've got, something awful happening. So I think it's a really tricky question, but I think it is something we ought to talk about. We're very British. We don't want to talk about money, but I'd always rather talk about motivation first. And then I suppose the last thing I'd say is something we have been doing is trying to be really clear about what the expectation is for board members. How much time in board meetings, how much time in committee meetings, how much time out seeing stock, how much time doing training strategy. You can get quite a lot of things done in 15 days a year if you're really thoughtful about how you use non-exec's time. So it's a challenge for the non-exec and for the executives alike, I think. Sorry, rambling.
Can I just, I think compensation brings a different sort of mindset. As Jane has articulated, you've got individuals who are looking to subsidize an income, but also we have to remember that in a resident's case that could be on benefits, that would affect them quite significantly. So we need to have this conversation in a way that doesn't exclude a resident, but makes them feel involved. Because this has been, I think, and Jane and Parveen will know this has been a thorny subject in the sector for years. and I mean years, what is the optimum amount to compensate someone? Well, it is what it is. The reality is, first and foremost, you're looking for people with the right skill set who are going to make the right contribution to the organization. The compensation then becomes a secondary conversation. But if it's the compensation first, well, I think you've got the argument the wrong way around.
Yeah, I would challenge both Jane and Delroy on that, because the reasons for that is it's like in an organization that wants to grow, if you get a good accountant, they'll make you wealthy. If you get an accountant without the right skill set, they'll bust your business. And if I take that analogy to what we're discussing here, yes, you may pay more for somebody 3 times more than what the organization would typically pay, but that is an investment that person coming in will grow the organization potentially 3 times more. So you've paid for that person's salary and more. You've created more, as long as they can demonstrate that they can add more value than what they're and common sense shows that an organization isn't going to pay 3 times more than, say, a regular amount, unless that individual is a results driven person that can come in and grow that organization in ways that perhaps somebody else can, and they've demonstrated that in their current job they do or in other organizations. So I definitely believe that it's about kind of having that broad long-term thinking when it comes to taking on good board members and paying them accordingly. It's just, I don't think it's a return on investment, and I think if it's done correctly, it can pay dividends.
And I think you're right on that, Parveen. I think the key thing is that you need to be intentional about it, and the organisation needs to be able to explain why it has chosen to do that. Because what we can't do is just say, well, let's just, non-executives need to be paid more, because what does that feel like to our residents who are coping, particularly at the moment, with cost of living crisis? So there is a real balance. So I think it's about intentionality, it's about having a clear strategy, and it's about being prepared to tell the story in a way which is unapologetic. And if you have to start feeling apologetic about it, you shouldn't be doing it in the first place.
Yeah, no, communication would be the issue rather than the actual issue of remuneration, for sure. I agree on that point. Yeah.
Brilliant. Should I hand back to you, Ed? I think as we're coming into the last 5 minutes.
Yes, absolutely. Well, firstly, just to thank all of our panelists again, Parveen, Delroy, Jane, for a really great conversation that we've packed so much into an hour. And this close to Christmas as well, I feel like we deserve an extra pass on the back. But to say a big thank you to our 3 panelists again, and to everyone in the chat. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for those who submitted questions. I know we didn't quite get to all of them, but we'll try and keep some of the questions that have been asked and ask them next time round, which will hopefully be early next year. We'll be doing our next panel, so please do look out for that as well. But just to finally sign off and say thank you so much, and yes, hope you'll join us again for another one of these events next year. Good.